So once again, when it comes to um, this idea of cultural evolutionism, we find that it's an ethnocentric theory. This is, again, one that Lewis Henry Morgan came up with, drawing upon ideas of technology. And so these are his terms, his words. He created this system. We go from lower savagery to middle savagery. And as you develop, you might become as advanced as lower barbarism, right? Um, so the idea is that societies, in theory, should over time, if all works out, if they develop as they should, they will develop in only one direction, and that is towards some sort of increasingly complex and quote unquote more advanced society. But what makes a society in the savagery category any more or less quote unquote advanced than one marked by quote unquote civilization? Again, this assumes a sort of unilineal trajectory that all societies must move through. It also assumes that all human groups develop or try to develop from hunter-gatherer clusters and groups to civilization. And so therefore it sort of makes Western culture and civilization to be the pinnacle of social evolution. This is something that cultural anthropologists are very critical of. It also assumes that cultural differences emerged from innate biological components. For example, why is it that we see certain kinds of people and ethnicities typically in the lower savagery tier and not in the civilization tier? It shows you the sort of racial implications of this problematic theory. And so therefore it could be used to justify European colonial rule. Again, we're talking about the late 1800s. This is the time in which it's the age of exploration. Europeans, but not just Europeans, but yes, also Europeans are traveling to the parts of the world in the global south and colonizing them for political and economic material gain. So just to chart out this, this process of cultural evolutionism, now it is, I have this slide here. Now, to be clear, it is absolutely true that there are different kinds of societies out there in the world, and certainly historically over time, right? Um, pre-modern human societies, when you go back to prehistoric, era, we had humans in hunter-gatherer groups, these small bands that are largely egalitarian, by which I mean there was no formal leader per se. Men and older people tended to have, and still in these hunter-gatherer groups tend to have more power in those societies. But it's not the same as a tribe, right? A tribe is where now you start to have some internal, informal leadership. You see a chiefdom developing after that, where whereas in a tribe you had people who are growing small kitchen gardens and raising animals. That's what we call horticulturalists or pastoralists. In a chiefdom, now we're seeing much more intensive agriculture that might include irrigation, for example. And you have a very clear chief, hence chiefdom, right? So you have this elite class, and they will have luxury goods. And then we get to a state, which, as I said before, under this theory of cultural evolutionism, tended to be represented by Western societies, right? Where there's complex systems of government, complex bureaucracy, etc. But again, anthropologists today do not believe in or subscribe to this theory. We do not think that all societies must or should, quote unquote, develop. What is develop, or what does it mean to develop? What does it mean to be more advanced, right? Does simply because in one society, citizens use iPhones mean that the society is somehow more, quote unquote, advanced? That is a deeper philosophical question that cultural anthropologists would pose nowadays. So to put this in context, right, we have on the origin of species, you should all be familiar with Charles Darwin, right? His work in 1859 on the origins of species argued for natural selection, right? That is this mechanism through which organisms will evolve in the natural world, right? The idea is that, right, some die out, some do not survive the natural world. Those that do will go on to, many of them, to breed, to reproduce. And so that over time will determine how a particular species, right, will evolve. One common mistake, however, that students make in trying to understand Darwin's idea is that evolution is not unilinear. We tend to think about this when we see that graphic of like different like apes all the way up to humans, right? It looks like it's this unilinear sort of one line form of development, but actually evolution can morph into various different paths, right? It's not such thing as like evolution involves evolving to more superior or inferior traits. No trait is more or less superior. They just happen to be more or less adapted to that current environment. This will be important. I will come back to this in just a moment. So we see that natural selection, biological evolution was incorrectly sort of used or influenced the way people thought about cultural evolutionism and social Darwinism. Now, you might have heard of social Darwinism in high school class, maybe at the same time when you were learning about eugenics. Social Darwinism is where we're simply taking the idea of Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest and sort of applying it to human societies, right? The belief that the biological or evolutionary concept of survival of the fittest can also be applied to human communities and to human social problems. The idea is that strong communities, cultures, or races will somehow outcompete problematic ones. So it was used to support, and still is sometimes used to support, ideas of racial or cultural superiority. Again, this borders on the concept of eugenics, which was believed that it was important for governments to engage in social engineering to be sure that only the most fit members of a society would reproduce, say, barring the ability of certain populations, like those living with certain mental disabilities, to be able to reproduce, right? So as you can see here, this is all very problematic from a contemporary ethical perspective, right? I'm going to give one example of how this sort of early period in proto-anthropology period merged with ideas about social Darwinism. Human zoo is a term that I'm using to describe a bunch of different ethnological displays of quote unquote other people, capital O, other people, racialized indigenous people from outside of Western Europe. Throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, you had various fairs and world exhibits, again, during the period of imperial reign throughout, let's take the example of Africa when it was colonized by much of Western Europe and America, wherein indigenous persons would be essentially forcibly removed or kidnapped from their communities and brought to, in this case, the case I'm about to describe, Belgium, where then they were then shown to the public. In 1897, 267 Congolese men, women, and children were kidnapped from the Congo and brought to a park in Belgium on the orders of King Leopold of Belgium. As you can see here in this map, it was Belgium at the time who owned, quote unquote, this part of Africa. Belgium was run by King Leopold, so technically speaking, this was the terrain of one man, of King Leopold, Belgium. These individuals, again, were brought to the Tervuren Park in Belgium. They were placed into several fenced, quote unquote, houses, right, near these ponds in the park. Again, fenced. You can see the fences here in some of these pictures. You can also see a Belgian audience on the other side of the fence staring at the Congolese. Now, King Leopold had brought them there in part because the idea was that this would help essentially sort of act as an important part of his public relations project to drum up support for colonizing the Congo. He had partaken in a very brutal reign in the Congo, in which there were many different rubber plantations. He was making a lot of money off of the Congo, and he wanted the he wanted the Belgian people to be in support of that. 7 of those Congolese died from pneumonia that very summer. They were buried in an unmarked grave, and only later were their remains moved to this church near the park. Pictured on the left is a postcard from that era of this exhibit. So at the same time, they constructed these villages, these essentially human zoos of Congolese people. King Leopold had also constructed a museum that was filled with traditional arts from the Congolese people, but also like stuffed animals from Central Africa as well. So the question I pose to you is, how does this exhibit reflect the concept of cultural evolutionism and social Darwinism? Again, how does this exhibit reflect the concept of cultural evolutionism and social Darwinism? I will encourage you to include a response to that question in your class engagement activity for today. I thought this was just really cool. Teddy Mazina is an African artist, and he created an exhibit titled Muzungu Tribes, meaning white people tribes, where he created this it's art, right? This photography exhibit in which he basically flipped the roles, and he made himself as an African measuring and studying the bodies of white people. And so I think it's interesting and important role reversal when we think of phrenology, which was the study of the cranium and the skull, right? To think about the racial implications of all of this. What happens when we reverse these roles of Black scientists measuring and studying white bodies? Just some food for thought. Okay. And now we come to Franz Boas. Do you remember what his contribution was to the field of anthropology? You learned about it in the podcast. I'm sorry, we will continue this conversation into the next lecture.